Hello, this is Paul Johnson with the Optimistic American. Now, today on our show, we're going to have a topic that is literally one of the most controversial topics going on in the country today. And that's whether or not we should have a third party on the ballot for the President of the United States. There's an organization called No Labels, which is working hard in all 50 states to try to put their party on the ballot. The logic to putting that party on the ballot is that it would make it easier to have a third-party ticket that could actually run. Now, we're seeing polling where, across the country, year after year in every presidential election, you've always seen high negatives for the Republican and Democratic candidate, 30, 35% negatives. We're running now in about the 60 to 70% negatives. The overwhelming majority of people in America don't want what's beginning to look like are the two top nominees for president. Well, the challenge is, if you run as an independent, states have created a lot of rules that make it very difficult for independents to get on. As an example, I pointed out in Arizona, if you run for governor, if you run as a Republican or Democrat, you need about 6,000 signatures. If you run as an independent, you have to get 50,000 signatures. They've done their best to discriminate against independent voters and independent candidates. But the Supreme Court's been pretty clear. You can put a party on the ballot. That people are guaranteed the right to freely assemble. And so getting a third party on and then looking for a third party ticket or a third party group of people that would run is something that's very possible. And No Labels is doing that. Now, my guest today is Senator Joe Lieberman. Joe has a very long history in the independent movement, and he's taking a lot of slings and arrows from people who are making all types of accusations about what his real goal or his real intent is. I think you'll enjoy this show. It's a great description of why Joe's been involved in the effort and how it is that No Labels can actually make a difference regardless of whether they're successful. Again, welcome to the Optimistic American. I think you're going to enjoy this show. Well, Senator Lieberman, thank you so much for being on the Optimistic American show today.
Well, I'm delighted to. I'm glad to join you. I consider you to be a kindred spirit, a fellow traveler in the road to more optimistic Americans, which I think we really are underneath all the political division and pessimism. And so God bless you for trying to bring that out. I look forward to our conversation.
All right, so we're going to talk about No Labels today. We're going to talk about political reform. But, you have an amazing story. And that I've watched it over the years. During the time I was mayor, I know that, I watched you end up being primaried and running as an independent. I want to know the way that you came to this. And probably the most fascinating part is I'm from Arizona. We're trying to get an item on the ballot this year that is about trying to ensure that independents and people who aren't registered in a party are treated equally. But you almost became vice president of the United States a second time, or at least the nominee for vice president, under a Republican nominee, our Senator John McCain, when he ran for president. I can't help, even though it's going to take up time from No Labels, I have to ask, how did that happen?
Well, it's quite a story, and it's really a tribute to John McCain because he was way ahead on that. I mean, I'll tell you briefly. So John and I were very close. We disagreed on a lot of domestic policy issues, though not all, but we agreed on almost every aspect of America's defense and foreign policy. We traveled a lot around the world visiting our troops, particularly during that period of time in Afghanistan and Iraq. And we just developed a lot of friendship and trust. So 2006, I have this tough race that you described. I lose the Democratic nomination for re-election to the Senate from Connecticut. I'm run as an independent. Thank God and the people of Connecticut, I got elected. So flash forward to 2007. John has launched his presidential campaign in the Republican Party, obviously. He's really almost out of it in the spring. He's fighting his way back. Right around Thanksgiving, he called me. And he said that for some reason he called me Joey, so I called him Johnny. I got a question for you. It's a hard one, and please know that whatever your answer won't affect our friendship. So I remember saying, "Hey, John, you got me interested now. What's the question?" And he said, "You know, I'm doing better in the Republican presidential primary. The big event is going to be in January in New Hampshire in the primary. Independents can vote in the New Hampshire primary. Right now, after last year, when you got elected as an independent, you know, you're Mr. Independent. So I called to ask you for your endorsement, which would help me a lot in New Hampshire." So I said, "You know, that's a tough one, but I'm going to think about it. Give me a day or two." I thought about it and I thought, you know, I'm an independent. John's my friend. I know he could be a great president. Neither of the Democrats running for president, Obama and Clinton, who were friends of mine, had called me because I was still on the wrong side as far as they were concerned of the Iraq war question. So I endorsed John, and fortunately we did win in New Hampshire. I don't take the credit for it. He won it. But so that's in the background. I campaigned for him. Then around June or May, he and his campaign manager said they'd like to put me on the list to be vetted for vice president. So I thought he was doing it to give me some publicity, to thank me for endorsing him. I said, "You don't have to do that. You know, no, it's not why I'm doing it." I said, "Well, John, I don't know." He said, "I'm serious about it." I said, "Hey, John, maybe you forgot. I'm a Democrat. You're a Republican." "Well, that's the point," he says. "The country's yearning for bipartisanship." So honestly, I was vetted. He stuck to it. Ultimately, the people in the party convinced him it would be really divisive, and people would walk out of the convention. This was mostly about my position on gay rights and choice. So John didn't do it. I never thought he could, so I wasn't surprised. Although God bless him, in his last book, he wrote that he thought that was one of the bigger mistakes he made in his life. I don't know that we could have won, but it really would have been historic, and I do think we would have done better than he ultimately did. And frankly, he would have felt better about it, which is also important.
Yeah, he was a great man. I have my stories with Senator McCain, and I definitely loved him. All right, so here's maybe a big question before we get to no labels. It seems like that the country is becoming more divisive in our politics. In fact, I think our politics is a lot more divisive than the public is. I have Republican friends, Democratic friends, independent friends, and they're never nearly as divided as what we're watching on cable news networks or what we're watching happening in the Senate and the House. What's taking place? Why is that negativity and that polarization there between the parties today?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that the public in America is still more united than the politicians and the parties. But the politicians and the parties fight each other for turf more than they ever did before, a lot of times refusing to do what's always been done in America to solve problems, which is to come to the center and from the left, right, Democrat, Republican, and talk to each other respectfully about what you're trying to do and get resolved, and compromise. So you don't get everything you want. You never do in politics or in life, probably. But if you compromise, you can get something good done. And frankly, if you're in office in Congress or the White House, you can get something done for the people who were good enough to elect you. So, but this is a tough time in our history. I don't deny that. There are a lot of changes that make some people very insecure. There's technological changes which make people worry about their job security. There are demographic changes, and it focuses around the immigration question. There are big cultural changes that have occurred as a result of the internet and other changes that are going on. And, you know, as always, people in leadership politics have the choice of trying to reconcile those points of view, as our great leaders have, like Lincoln and Washington did right at the beginning. All the founders did, or to exploit them for their own benefit. Both parties are just in perpetual political campaigns exploiting them. But honestly, you look at some of the polling. There was a poll done a while ago by, I believe it was Gallup, so it's credible, it's not political. 49% of the American people describe themselves politically as independents. Almost half. Amazing. Highest ever. And really, that's a reaction to the Republican and Democratic parties, which a lot of Americans are fed up with because they think they spend more time fighting each other than trying to fix our problems. So I'm going to tell you a little vignette that I was part of recently. It's far from politics, but it said something to me. I went out. I live in New York now because we have the kids and grandkids here, and I took a bunch of them to a New York Yankees game about 2 weeks ago. So this happens always. It happens in Arizona, I'm sure, with the team. A lot of very different people unite supporting the local sports team, and they really love doing that. Nobody looks at what your politics are, what the color of your face is, or whatever. But the other remarkable thing that happened in the seventh inning stretch, and it's a tradition now at Yankee Stadium, a guy in his 80s walks out with a cane, and he stands there, and they introduce him, and he's a veteran of the Vietnam War, and they pay tribute to him, and then we all sing "God Bless America," and I got to tell you, the players were out of the dugout steps. They were singing. Everybody in the stands, and there were tens of thousands there, were singing. And I said, beneath all the political partisan nonsense, this is really America at its best. And it's what the American people want. So you asked me what's causing this. There's a lot of real problems that make people insecure. But too many of our leaders try to exploit that insecurity and divide our country. And really, most people in our country are much more united, much more devoted to America, much less devoted to their political parties. And they just want us all, as Rodney King said, to figure out a way to get on with one another and get something good done for our country.
All right, so I'm going to jump to no labels, and here's what stands out to me. In our country today, about 80% of the public is actually registered to vote. 44% are actually registered, or they're non-affiliated with the party. That leaves about 30% that are Democrat, 30% that are Republicans. In a high turnout primary, the turnout's about 35%. Now, if you do that math, 80% by the 30% by the 35% turnout, you get to about 8 to 9% of the people actually vote in a Republican primary or actually vote in a Democratic primary. And those people, after having run in one, it became clear to me, they are much more extreme and divisive and actually don't even want you to talk to the other side. They're more vitriolic. That doesn't mean all Republicans are that way, because there are a bunch of Republicans who don't vote in the primary who then vote in the general. It doesn't mean all Democrats are that way, because there are a bunch of Democrats who will oftentimes miss the primary but vote in the general. But the primaries drive us to a more extreme point of view. And then even moderate candidates have a harder time because they know that they can be primaried later on. To me, becoming an independent, it really was a release. It gave me the ability to think independently and to be able to think about ideas in a much different way. Part of what I see that's going on with no labels is just this whole idea that you're trying to release people from the shackles of the party, to be able to think independently, to be able to think creatively. The question I have is, are we going to be able to get no labels on the ballot in all 50 states? Because I know running as an independent is very, very difficult. The parties have created all types of constraints in different locations that make it much more difficult for an independent to actually be on the ballot. You've been the leader of that effort. I'd like to kind of know where we are.
Okay, first I want to tell you that your analysis of the problem is brilliant and right on target. You did it quickly. Those numbers are real and compelling. And so we got a system now that where a minority of members of both parties dominate the nominating procedures. And they're not reflective not only of the broader population, but even of the full membership of each of their parties. And they exercise real influence on challengers and incumbents who actually want to get elected and or stay in office. They make them risk averse. They feel like they have to toe the party line. And the party line is often, we hate the other party. And that's not the way you fulfill your responsibility to the country and your constituents. Incidentally, one of the best things that could happen, and I go back to my story about John McCain and the New Hampshire primary, is if every state in the country let independents vote in both primaries, major party primaries. That would really open it up. But so let me tell you about no labels. We've worked for now almost a little more than a dozen years, and the whole idea why it was founded was to try to get us back to where the country was, where there were centrists in both parties that would work together in Congress. And the way it used to happen, not so long ago, President Reagan, Speaker Tip O'Neill worked across party lines to solve a big crisis in Social Security in the 80s. In the 90s, President Clinton, Speaker Gingrich, very odd couple, but smart, policy wonks, smart enough to know politically that they would both benefit if they could get something done. So they passed a whole raft of things: welfare reform, criminal justice reform, most important of all, Balanced Budget Act of 1997, which actually balanced the budget. The last 3 years of the Clinton administration had a surplus. So we can do it, and that we've been electing centrist Republicans and Democrats to Congress. But then our members said, you know, we've got to speak in this 2024 election for president, because it's going to be, again, the same two candidates if nothing happens, Trump and Biden, but it's going to be the same attack, counterattack, and then whichever one is elected, it's going to be the same partisanship. So we have adopted a platform, a common sense, we call it. We're actually launching it Monday, July 17th in New Hampshire. But we're also working very hard to qualify for the ballot for a third line in every one of the 50 states. And we call it an insurance policy project. We hope that both parties, or at least one, will move more to the center and give us a better choice than the one that most of the American people don't want, which is Trump and Biden again. And if not, we want to be in a position to actually run a bipartisan third ticket to try to do exactly what you're talking about, as the optimistic American. Instead of having politicians divide the country, we're trying to create a standard of unifying the country. That's why we say no labels. Forget you're a Democrat or Republican, you're an American, and we all got to work together to get this done. So we're making real progress at the state level. So far, it still looks like both parties will nominate the two presidents, Trump and Biden, and then we're going to have a big decision to make next year, if that is still the case, as to whether we want to do a third ticket. Third tickets, independents, as you know, have a tough time in American politics. The last really successful third ticket at the presidential level was none other than probably our greatest president, Abraham Lincoln, in 1860. But this is a very unusual divided time. And you've got now on polling a majority of people saying they don't like the choice of Trump and Biden, and over 50% on some polls, about 30% on others saying they would be open to supporting a third ticket, particularly one that was moderate, independent, and bipartisan. So we'll see. I mean, it's the future of our country. Unless we act and try something differently, we're going to continue to be in the same divided, pessimistic rut that we've been in for too many years now.
Yeah, you know, it's in Arizona where the Democratic Party filed a lawsuit. I've taken some grief from Democratic friends of mine, people who I've liked and known for a long time. But what's amazing to me is their sense of entitlement. You know, the idea that they say is we should have a clear shot at this. And the answer is, this isn't about you. This is about the American people and whether or not they should have choices. And why is it that you think that you're entitled to a clear shot if you're not appealing to people in the center? You have a job to do. If you appeal to people in the center, you won't have to worry about it. But I understand what those partisan primaries do. They force even moderate candidates to go appeal to the excesses of their party on both sides. And I think that's part of why the American public is just saying, we want something different. We want something more. I also think there's an advantage sometimes getting on. You talked about Bill Clinton a minute ago, balancing the budget. Part of why he balanced the budget is he had Ross Perot on the ticket, and he began to recognize that there was a benefit to appeal back to that center.
That's true. And we have that in mind. It's a really good point because though a third party candidate for president has not been elected since Lincoln, third party candidates, if they've been credible and not just minor party spoilers, really can make a difference on policy. And Ross Perot did. He put the balanced budget as a national priority. Bill Clinton and those debates and Al Gore embraced it. And by God, they did something about it. And I stress again, they only could do it because they engaged the Republican Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, in that process. And together they did something great for the country and also, frankly, great for themselves. Clinton and Gingrich politically. I wish people today would have that same vision. You know, what you said is right. There's a sense of entitlement. What are you guys doing here? But incidentally, it is the Supreme Court has ruled a constitutionally protected right that Americans have to try to gain access for a new party on the ballot. I mean, they really said it as part of our right of free association under the First Amendment. And the more people do what's happened in Arizona to try to challenge our ballot access projects, even though we get the required number of signatures and they're legal, the more we're going to hold them accountable, really, for violating our constitutional rights. And we're serious about it because this is a serious matter.
All right, can you just help, maybe as one of our last questions, because I know that we had some limits on time here, could you just give us an understanding of, at the end of the day, it's not a majority of the voters that we have to get, it's a majority of the Electoral College. So what happens in that process? What happens in that process if, what's necessary for the No Labels Party to get to the amount of delegates that are necessary to actually become president?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So we did a big poll last December, 26,000 people across the country, hundreds in every state. And it showed actually, and of course, we don't have a ticket and we won't have one until next year. So the choice was Trump, Biden, or I guess it was phrased a moderate, independent, maybe bipartisan third ticket. And actually on that one, it was over 50% said they were open to the third ticket. There have been polls done a little more recently that have that number as 20 or 30. You know, in the poll we did last December, and we're going to do another big one this fall, that number of voters, if we got like 2/3 of them, would be enough for the third line bipartisan ticket to get the most electoral votes, even over the 271 necessary. Now, this is all theoretical because we don't have a ticket. If we run, which is not certain, we really got to get a strong bipartisan ticket, but it's in range. I mean, even one of the groups formed to stop no labels is apparently around with a poll that shows Trump and Biden in the 30s as preferred by the voters, and a moderate independent third ticket at 21%. Now, that's pretty close. We think if we get to about a third of the voters, we're going to win some electoral votes, maybe enough to elect our candidates, but certainly enough to send this next year's election to the House of Representatives. And it ain't easy, but we'll have a whole new battleground in the House where it really is up to the members of the House from both political parties. Every state has one vote determined by a vote of their members of the House. But we're not going to do this. We're not going to run a third party ticket unless we think that we actually have a chance, no guarantees, to get enough electoral votes to elect that ticket. And again, we want it to be constructive. If we see on the polling that we're going to, as the Democrats keep worrying and yelling, we're going to reelect Donald Trump, I doubt that we'll run a ticket. We don't want to do that. We want, and listen, our polling showed that we took pretty much equally from Republicans and Democrats. Going back to 92, interestingly, the exit polls show that Ross Perot took pretty equally from Republicans and Democrats, Bush 41 and Clinton that year. So we're in the arena and we're trying to speak to exactly what you're speaking to, which is optimistic Americans, and to try to be unifying and not divisive, beginning with a bipartisan ticket.
Senator Lieberman, thank you so much for coming onto our show. The last thing I'll just say is I think this is important, even if you don't have a ticket, because you're forcing people to address the problem, which is you can't just keep ignoring the vast majority of Americans who want something better. Thank you for your efforts on this.
Thanks for saying that. God bless you. Good luck in what you're doing. See you soon.
All right. Thank you. Outside of my role as the optimistic American, I've also played a role in trying to help create reforms that would ensure that unaffiliated voters, people who are not a member of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, would both as voters and candidates have an equal ability to participate. This show that we had with Joe Lieberman today really is talking about how it is that at the national level, utilizing the office of presidency and no labels, that we can make a difference that helps ensure that that people have to pay attention to those people who are in the center. But there are other reforms. Those other reforms include things like getting rid of partisan primaries and opening up the early primaries where independent voters or non-affiliated voters and unaffiliated candidates can't be discriminated against. There are other movements like the Top 5 effort that you can see on our program with Catherine Gale, who talks about how you could have a instant runoff with the ranked choice voting and how that would be helpful to the system. But regardless, what this really all comes down to is that there are a large group of people, an increasingly growing number of people, who are not satisfied with what the two parties are doing. Now, I'm going to cut the two parties a break here just for a moment. Here's the break. I have found that both parties, people in both parties, have a lot to contribute to the system. The Democratic Party, people I know in the Democratic Party, most of them are very concerned about programs that affect individuals, education and parks and recreation, and making certain that we're working with youth offenders or people who've gotten into trouble. And on the other side, the Republican Party, I think that they've done a lot, or there are many people there who are deeply concerned about the human spirit, about the ability to own what you create and what you innovate, and allowing that innovation and that creation to be able to help humankind through the free market system. Both sides bring a benefit. I couldn't imagine this country without Hamilton and Jefferson, both of them on opposite sides of the ledger. But both of them played an important role in the development of the United States. Hamilton played a key role in making certain that we had a central government, that we had the funding for a central government, that the U.S. Treasury was set up, and that we took care of the good faith and credit of the United States. And Thomas Jefferson played a huge role in the Bill of Rights in ensuring that the individual stayed at the center. There's definitely room for both. Unfortunately, the partisan system has been used as an ability for the extremes to dominate beyond their numbers, to have a control that's beyond their numbers. I spoke about it in this show, the numbers, but again, I want you to think about this. 80% of the people are registered. 40% of them are independents or unaffiliated. That means in the partisan primaries, only about 30% of that 80% actually are in a party. That by itself takes you down to about 27%. But then in the primaries, only about 30% of the people turn out. You're talking about 6 or 7% of the public. And I can promise you, I've polled in both of those two parties. Those voters are much more extreme than the general public. And here's what they want: orthodoxy. They have no desire to have their candidates compromise with people in the center. So increasingly, those people who don't have a point of view that just comes from one standpoint, they're increasingly looking for something more, for people who can cross the aisle, to find a way to make certain that this country can work. That's really what this whole effort, in my opinion, is about. I'm not sure that no labels will be successful. I hope they are. I would love to see an actual presidency that had a bipartisan ticket of people on both sides. But it's going to make the two parties address this big divide that's happening and how a group of people in the American public want something better. Now, our goal at the Optimistic American, it's to try to rekindle the American spirit. It's to try to give people hope that we actually can do better. If you like what we're doing on our show, I hope you'll press the subscribe button or comment if you don't like what we're doing. I'm always interested in reading your input. And while I don't respond, especially to some of the more vitriolic comments that will come in, I do read them. And I try to think about them and try to figure out whether or not we're acting in the way in which we should be acting to make certain that we are promoting optimism and hope. We hope also you'll support our mission. And if you'd like to, you can go to optimisticamerican.com/premium and take part in our program to become a premium member and avoid all the commercials that you'll oftentimes see with the different platforms that we're on. But last, most important, you live in one of the greatest countries in one of the greatest periods of time ever. There's no better place to be and no better time to be there than right here and right now. Our real goal is America is doing much better than our political system seems to indicate. In fact, our political system isn't serving up to the greatness of America. This is a subject that we need to spend time on. It's one that we need to think about. But never lose faith in who we are. This is a great country. We have a lot of runway in front of us. And we're going to see some changes that ensure that that greatness happens. Again, welcome to the Optimistic American. Thank you for taking part, and we hope that you enjoyed this show. Thanks for joining the Optimistic American show. Now, help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned. We can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.